This is Around the A, a weekly look at the top stories, news, and interviews from the NHL's top developmental league, with your hosts David Foote and Patrick Williams on the Sports Podcasting Network.
It's been about 9 weeks since we were last with you here on Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network. A lot has happened in that time. When we took our break, we weren't really sure which way things were going to go. Now we have a little bit of finality, at least on the 2019-20 season, and we know that for the first time since 1936, the Calder Cup will not be awarded as the American Hockey League shuts down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. David Foote and Patrick Williams here. It's, like I say, been a little while, Pat, we were here, but nice to be back, even given these, somewhat upsetting for a lot of people circumstances.
Yeah, it is nice to be back. I think obviously anybody could relate to this. At the past 2 months or so, really nothing has been normal, and I think the thing with this is just this has touched everybody in some way, shape, or form, whatever industry you're in, whatever, really anywhere in the world, almost wherever you are, to some extent, in some cases, for some people a lot more than others. The impact of this has just been so tremendous, and the American Hockey League flies under the radar most of the time, but the hockey world, even the hockey world where it's pretty much go, 11, 12 months a year, even the hockey world eventually got caught up in this, and here we are as a result. And, I think as much as the, pretty much I think everybody expected the announcement that came this week from the American Hockey League, but even when it finally does come through, it does kind of a little bit jarring with the finality of it. And then more importantly, I think what it does, it opens up a whole nother line of questions going forward. What does the AHL look like, 5 months from now, a year from now? Who knows? So I think there are a lot of questions. I keep coming back to the thought that just it's ironic in a lot of ways that AHL President, CEO Dave Andrews built the league up so much over the last 26 years, and now he was almost, the final hurdle of his tenure, and now all this happens. So in a lot of ways, there's going to be a lot of work still to do. And I think Scott Hellson, the new replacement coming in starting July 1st, will have his work cut out for him. But, there's a lot to break down, to put it mildly. And but it's nice to be back for sure.
Yeah, a lot to break down. And for Dave Andrews, unfortunate that his tenure has to end during something like this, but almost fitting, seeing how much he's been able to do for this league over his 26 years at the helm. And now he's going to be the guy to have to pass the torch under these circumstances, but nobody knows this league better. And speaking of Dave Andrews, I've used the term milestone episode on this program, thrown it around rather loosely, but I think this is the time to put it out there again. It's a milestone episode. It's episode 20. It's also a milestone because Dave Andrews is going to be on with us in just a little bit to talk about all of this, and you want answers. You want to know what's going on. And how the league is going to deal with it. We're going right to the source in what is sure to be an exceptional conversation with Dave Andrews as we try to dig through all of these questions. And like you say, how is the league going to be affected? How long are these effects going to last? It's a lot of stuff that we honestly don't have answers to, and Dave might not even have answers to, but he at least will hopefully be able to give us a little bit of insight into how the league and how the Board of Governors has handled this situation, because it is still fresh, the full-on cancellation of the season. It was only announced at the beginning of this past week, and there was a lot of wondering in the last 8 weeks what was going to happen. So still not a whole lot of information that's come out since that cancellation was official.
Well, exactly, and I think the other big issue is that there's just no precedent for this. There's no playbook to go back on. Even with things like lockouts and things of that nature, there was a kind of a blueprint that teams and general managers and leagues could look at or refer to, learn from past mistakes. But this is all kind of flying by the seat of their pants and trying to handle it as best they can, and trying to do so with something that's really not under their control at all. I mean, this is under, I guess, the control, I might say, Mother Nature and science and everything like that. So for a sport where coaches and GMs want to, obviously we know they all like to control as much as they can and keep out distractions. This is the polar opposite of that. This is the ultimate distraction. This is the ultimate thing that you don't have control over, and you're at the mercy of a lot of these forces. And you're also flying without instruments right now. So I think for teams, for leagues, and right up to Dave Andrews, his pay grade, there's a lot of questions, and I think you're right. Even Dave won't have the answers to all of them, simply because there's really nothing to go on. The last time something like this happened in such a wide scale was 1918, and obviously the professional sports world and the world itself was completely different.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of learning on the fly, and just there's going to be mistakes made along the way, and it'll be just a matter of when those mistakes do happen, trying to recover from them quickly and bounce back, because leagues and teams and executives are just they're really trying to handle this, and this is such a huge problem to get their arms around. There's going to be some stumbles along the way. I think so far they've hit it well, but there's a lot more still to go.
And I think one of the biggest things is, as much as you can classify the American Hockey League along with other professional sports, because it is a pro sports league, there are a lot of things about this league that make the situation increasingly difficult if you compare it to the NHL or the NBA or Major League Baseball. And that is really what's going to be telling about the situation and what's making it difficult to figure out a way forward, and a fair way forward for all 31 teams, because the AHL is a league, and I'm sure those of you who've been paying attention to the situation know that this league is heavily dependent on the money that it makes at the gate, the money that teams make by selling tickets and getting butts in the seats, and where all these other leagues are talking about potentially resuming without fans because they have to do that. In all likelihood, that's not an option for the American Hockey League, and that's going to make the whole situation a lot tougher moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, the NHL obviously has its own problems right now, but those teams operate on margins of, in the tens of millions. Their owners are, obviously all extremely wealthy, and certainly American Hockey League owners are as well, but they're not at that level of wealth where they can absorb these kind of hits for very long. And it's a league also where, like you said, it's state driven. I mean, there's sponsorship money that does come in, and that's an important part of the business model. But for the most part, it comes down to putting people in seats, selling beers and hot dogs and things like that, and bringing those people in time after time after time. And it's not an elite with any real significant media rights money to speak of or anything of that nature. So it's elite in the best of times. It's a difficult battle, and you have to hustle. And those front offices out there, that's why they really beat a path trying to sell those tickets every year. And now you're trying to do it where so much of your fan base has been affected, at least in some way, financially. And if they haven't been yet, I think most people, at least, it's on their mind. And that extends right into all your sponsorships. The businesses that are hurting right now, that are closed. It's difficult for them to think about sponsoring, a hockey team, buying an ad on the boards or an ad in the program. Mm-hmm. When they're not sure how long they're going to be around. So it's all these different things that teams have to navigate, and you have to do it in a sensitive way as well. That as much as if you're a team, you're having cash flow challenges or questions, you also do have to be mindful of the fact that so are your fans and your sponsors. And a lot of teams in the last 2 months, talking to different people, a lot of that's just been kind of nurturing those existing relationships that you have with your sponsors and your fan bases. And your fans, I should say, and making sure that those remain strong because they're definitely being tested right now, both economically and I think just in terms of the longer you're out of the spotlight as a product, kind of out of sight, out of mind. So that's a challenge for teams to remain kind of in the mind of their fans, especially when those fans have so much else to think about right now.
Yeah, well, again, we're going to touch on a lot of plans moving forward with the outgoing president and CEO of the American Hockey League, Dave Andrews, coming up in just a little bit. We'll talk about just that. How do you keep sponsors on board? How do you keep fans coming back to the rink when they're allowed to? There's a lot in the works around this league right now, including the establishment of a new franchise out in Henderson, Nevada, to be the affiliate of the Vegas Golden Knights. You've got a handful of affiliation agreements up in the air right now, so we'll touch on all of that. But maybe before we start looking too far ahead, Pat, why don't we put some finality on this 2019-20 season? The Board of Governors, again, canceling the campaign, saying that based on winning percentage, the standings are final, and that would mean that the Milwaukee Admirals are the top team in the league, but it does not mean that they're going to be awarded the Calder Cup, and we're not sure about teams that won their divisions, like the Belleville Senators, who had an incredible year, the Providence Bruins, who really pushed back into an excellent spot, and then the Tucson Roadrunners, who I think surprised a lot of people this year. No word on if they'll be awarded anything for their accomplishments. That's perhaps one of the most difficult pills, I think, to swallow for some of those teams that put together really good seasons.
Absolutely. There were so many interesting storylines across the league. You had Providence, a team that kind of year in and year out always seems to find a way to put together a really strong product on the ice, but this year especially, they led the Eastern Conference. They were really neck and neck with the Hershey Bears and the Belleville Senators for first place in the Eastern Conference, but they had a 13-game point streak going on at the time of the season's pause back on March 12th. 12 of those games were wins. They were just rolling. And I thought another really neat story was the Charlotte Checkers, who, defending champs, came back with so much of their team gone and really had a rough first 2 months. And yet turned it around and got themselves into a playoff spot pretty comfortably, 8 points above the line there. And a team like Belleville, still trying to find themselves in the Belleville market. Really just have a young, fast, exciting team that really could, win any way you want on some nights. And the Binghamton Devils rallying. After so many rough years, just one of the most dangerous teams really in the second half. So you go right down the list. Milwaukee, obviously an amazing season, 90 points already, and they had an excellent chance to win a Calder Cup this year. But I think the Iowa Wild would have had something to say about that. And even out in the Pacific Division, that division's always kind of a roller derby of 5 or 6 teams every year just battling. They play such a division-heavy schedule, and a great Tucson Roadrunners team. That would have been a fun team to see make the playoffs and make some noise. And right down the list, it's just a sad situation for the league, just because every year in this league there's so much turnover that it's parity. That you always get some different playoff races, and you really had a number of franchises this year that really could have used the boost of a nice playoff run.
Yeah, and the money as well, as we talked about. You're going to sell out, you'd hope, most playoff games, and that's where you really help to build yourself a cushion moving into next season, and that's revenue that all these teams are going to be without now because of it. It's got to be tough for the players, right? Like, I've spoken to a few guys who... and this was a couple weeks ago at least, who, were still kind of working out at home, doing their best to self-isolate and things like that. And I think while everybody kind of had the feeling that this day would come, that we wouldn't be back again, nobody was really talking about it. And I can only imagine from a player's perspective, how they're feeling right now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting situation. I was talking to Derek Kane, longtime NHL player, head coach of the Rockford Ice Hogs, out there at the Chicago Blackhawks affiliate, and he made a great point. And it was basically, when you sit down and you try to design an off-season training program for a lot of your players, especially the guys that are younger, 20, 21, and are still kind of developing, you have a pretty good template normally that, okay, the season starts in October, therefore we need to do this thing at this time. Well, now you think the season may start in October, but you're not really that confident about that. So how do you design a program? And he brought up the point that one thing he's concerned about is players overtraining, that if you have some of these young guys that's trained 4 or 5 months consecutively, they may burn themselves out. Even when the next season does start. So there's that concern. Then I think obviously there's a concern that maybe some players with such a fuzzy deadline out there that's months away, maybe some of them kick back a little bit too much and don't quite have that motivation, especially with lack of access to training facilities and things like that. So there's kind of just a lot of different questions to navigate that typically they don't have to do. And, hockey's obviously such a routine-oriented sport. And, for the most part, this month means you're doing this thing. But now it's kind of just everybody's in this holding pattern, and it's really hard to plan. And I think this is where your conditioning coaches and nutritionists and things like that really are going to earn their money even more so than usual, because they have to find a way to strike that right balance between too much and not enough in terms of conditioning.
This is episode 20 of Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network with David Foote and Patrick Williams, the president and CEO of the American Hockey League, Outgoing. That is, Dave Andrews will be with us in just a little bit to talk about the cancellation of the season, what's next for the league because of this COVID-19 pandemic, and more. You mentioned the timeline, Pat, and I mean, you and I have both fielded a lot of questions even before the cancellation was officially made, because again, it's pretty much been inevitable that it was coming. It's fuzzy, like you say. We don't have really any idea. I mean, I don't know when I'm going to be able to go out of town 2 hours to see my family, let alone when we're going to be able to travel to play hockey again. And especially being here in the North Division, you look at the teams in this division. Toronto has been hit fairly hard by it. Montreal, Laval area has been hit real hard by it. And then upstate New York, where you've got Syracuse and Utica and Rochester and Binghamton. Upstate New York has been decimated by COVID-19. And with all due respect to those locales, nobody wants to go there right now. And the bigger issue, perhaps, is nobody can go there right now. The border's still closed between Canada and the U.S. Both those borders closed to international travel, which makes things difficult for European players who have to come back. There is so much that needs to be waded through before any type of real decision can be made moving forward.
Yeah, and that comes back to just so much is out of the control of the league right now. And, the border's a great example because, the border people are the ones that call the shots, not the other way around. And until you can get that situation resolved, I don't see any way you could really run the league in any sort of
with or without fans
meaningful way, because you need to be able to get your players into the country to start with, and then obviously back and forth, and as well as anybody how much, the Belleville Senators, they may play in Belleville one night, down in Syracuse the next night, and come back home the following night. So hopping back and forth across the border is a routine thing in this league for a lot of teams. And 4 Canadian teams, 27 in the U.S., but pretty much every team in this league at some point or another has to go north of the border or south of the border. So it's just a situation where until that's resolved, among many other issues, I just don't see any way for this league to play.
And, we're going to do our best to not compare to the National Hockey League and what they're trying to do right now to get players back on the ice and games going again, because, again, the NHL can afford to play in empty buildings. But as is the case with this league, there is always that connection to the National Hockey League. And for me, I start wondering about AHL players who are on that NHL bubble. And let's say the NHL starts up again this summer, which is something that has been discussed. What happens to AHL players who are on that bubble? Do they expand rosters? Like, how do you stay in shape and keep the development aspect of the American Hockey League intact when your league isn't playing? That's something else they're going to have to figure out.
Well, especially, and like you said, you have European players. That's a factor. You also have the European leagues. They have their own questions right now as far as what they're going to do. And, as we know that players in this league routinely, find opportunities to play over in Europe, especially some of the older players, and then vice versa, guys that, come over here as prospects from Europe. That's going to affect the player market, free agent pool whenever free agency happens. And that was another issue. I spoke with Brian Helmer, president of the Hershey Bears, earlier, and he made a great point that perhaps maybe you'll just stick with the players because free agency may just not look like what it typically does. And so maybe you won't go get too adventurous in free agency, given that you don't really know what you're dealing with. So that's just one factor to start with. And, it's just, as far as, players, prospects, some of them are going to – this could be their big break. If they go on a taxi squad, so to speak. Maybe they get, in front of, the head coach of the NHL club or the general manager on a more day-to-day basis and really, take advantage of that opportunity. For them, that could be their big break and the last they see of the AHL. For other players, they're going to be trying to come back after sitting out for, 3-4 months? Even if you're trying to train as best you can, obviously, you're nowhere near game action, and you're certainly not able to work out and train, as you as you would typically would. So, it's kind of, if you're a young player and you go up there and you make a bad impression, simply because you're not just able to, really be at the top of your game right now, that could be a break as well. So, there's just so many variables here. And as I said earlier, we have nothing to go on. There's no precedent for this. There's nothing you can kind of look back at and see how things unfolded, in previous times. This is all new to everybody, and everybody's trying to figure it out as they go along. And I think that's when you just have so many variables and so many unknown questions. How do you plan for something that really is so, like we said, fuzzy? So I think it's just going to be a really difficult situation going forward.
Yeah, it may seem like we're jumping around a little bit here on episode 20 of Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network. But again, that's just because there is so much to talk about, so many different topics you can hit. And again, this issue is not one that's going to be cleared up anytime soon, but we are going to do our best to maybe make the picture a little bit sharper with Dave Andrews coming up in just a little bit. Before we get to Dave, Pat, perhaps the biggest story of the season, regardless of whether or not it finished early, is the move of the San Antonio Rampage to Vegas or to Henton. We mentioned that team still looking at getting things set up in the midst of all this. But, talk about a kick in the gut for those fans in San Antonio. I think one of the last episodes we had on was right after that move to Vegas got made official, and the fans in San Antonio were somewhat blindsided by the move. And now here they are, not going to get a chance to even finish off the season with the team that has been, had its home there for so many years. What do you make of the way that this has all ended for the San Antonio Rampage?
Every fan base, I think, in hockey has been through a lot, but has any fan base that, you can ever recall in any sort of recent memory been through as much as that fan base has? They're chugging along. As we know, they've never really had great teams on the ice, but the fan support was always there. I think people underestimated that market a lot. You think, well, it's a typical non-traditional market, quote unquote. But they were 12th in the league in attendance, over 6,000 fans a night for a team that was, very much up and down this season, and really had this team kind of yanked out from under them. And really, I mean, the whole thing happened quickly. Dave Andrews mentioned at the All-Star game late January that Vegas was a possibility, but even he was not too optimistic that it would happen anytime soon. And certainly nobody had San Antonio on the radar, up to and included, I think, the St. Louis Blues, who found themselves very blindsided by this as well. So, not only do you lose your team if you're a San Antonio fan, but you don't even get a proper goodbye. They played their final home game on March 8th, Sunday afternoon, and 4 days later, everything shut down, and that was the end of it. There's no closure there, and I just feel really bad. That was a strong market in this league for a long time, even though, like I said, they didn't have a whole lot to cheer for. They went through a number of affiliations, I believe 5, in 18 years. Seemed to finally have something going well with St. Louis, and then all this happens. So they lose their team. They don't get that send-off, and that's the end of San Antonio, at least for now. I mean, I think if you could ever get a building situation resolved there, I think it'd be a great team to have, a great franchise to have back in the league. But as we all know, with 32 teams now, it's going to be really difficult to get your clubs, to get a club, to get your hands on a franchise, if you lose it. And that's the situation those fans find themselves in right now. And it's just a shame because, hockey in so many ways has moved, heaven and earth in the last, 25, 30 years, really, since the Wayne Gretzky trade in the 80s. To put hockey in the Sun Belt and markets like that. And, in the past 7 years, the AHL's lost Houston and lost to San Antonio. Neither one of those markets because of fan support, but simply because of building issues and just cost cutting. So it's a real shame. Those are two major markets. Houston's the fourth largest city in the States, and two really good, solid fan base, and I know a lot of fans down there. They followed their team. They were as passionate about their team as any NHL team or fan would be about their team. So they lose their team, and it's just a shame. And honestly, I feel so badly for those fans because they didn't deserve it. They didn't get they were never treated great by the hockey gods when they had a club in terms of winning, and then even when they lose their team, they lose it, in an especially, I think, difficult manner. So it's a real sad situation. It's a major loss for the league. I think as great as it is to have a team in Vegas, this is a major loss as well. Losing a pretty strong market, top 15 for sure market in this league. That's a big cost to pay for sure.
Yeah, and a team like the Texas Stars immediately loses a natural rival. They played each other 12 times a year, and obviously that's going to make a big dent in the schedule. And probably we talked about how important gate is. Those Texas San Antonio games, I'm sure, were drawing pretty big down there, and that's going to hurt them there. But obviously, the Golden Knights pay the price to get a team. They are able to make that move and do what's best for their franchise, and it is unfortunate for those fans in San Antonio to have to go through this. A couple more minutes here, Pat, before we get on to Dave Andrews and get him on the line with us. What else should we touch on here before we get the big guy on?
I would definitely keep an eye on the airline industry going forward. Big chunk of this league, this is a coast-to-coast league, stretches from Laval all the way up to San Diego, and a lot of teams in between. A number of teams travel almost exclusively by plane, but air travel's down 96%, right? So obviously that has a massive impact on the airline industry, especially in some of your more mid-tier size cities, service being reduced or cut altogether, and how does that affect teams that need to get around? Like you mentioned, the Texas Stars. Well, every road trip for them now starts with a plane ride, the more your options are cut, the more expensive it becomes, and then that doesn't even begin to get into obviously the health issues that you're putting 25 players. Teams almost fly exclusively commercial. Occasionally, late in the playoffs, maybe the NHL team will lend them their plane, for a charter flight. But for the most part, you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, taking the 7 a.m. flight out of town, maybe connecting somewhere, to get to some of these cities, and you're sitting in a plane in an airport, and obviously all the health concerns that come with that now. So that's another issue to really resolve. And even if you play regionally, you looked at the Central Division, that's spread out all the way from Texas up to Winnipeg, up to Michigan, and obviously the core Midwest teams. So even out in the Pacific Division, Colorado, Tucson, they fly quite often, and to get up there. And even within California, teams will fly maybe from Ontario, San Jose. So it's pretty hard to avoid, especially once you go out to the Western Conference, to avoid air travel. But how you're going to do it, that's the big question. So one of the many, we could fill a book with issues. All the things that you have to resolve, and with no, like I said, no playbook to go on, and no real control over so much of the situation. I don't envy a lot of these teams and front offices that have to somehow manage to wade through all this, because it is an absolute mess right now.
Yeah, it's a global issue, and when something gets as big as this is, the American Hockey League, as wide as it spreads, becomes just a tiny little speck in the entire picture. But we're doing our best to zoom in on that speck here on Around the A and let you know as much as we can how the league will be dealing with things moving forward. With that, let's get the most in-depth, I think, that we can about these issues. The President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Hockey League coming up here with us. Dave Andrews is rounding out his 26th and final season at the helm of the league. Amongst his accomplishments, he helped to double the AHL's membership from 16 to 32 teams. He spearheaded the absorption of 6 IHL teams in 2001. Helped with the big push out west in 2015. He's got a pile of experience, a pile of knowledge, and hopefully a pile of info to share with us about this situation as well. Before we get to Dave, we'll remind you can interact with us on social media at Around the A Pod, aroundtheapod@gmail.com if you want to shoot us an email. And, of course, you can hear us here on the Sports Podcasting Network or anywhere else you get your podcast. Let's do it then. Let's get to the President and CEO of the American Hockey League, Dave Andrews, on episode 20 of Around the A. It is episode 20 of Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network with David Foote and Patrick Williams as we continue to break down and discuss the end to the American Hockey League's 2019-20 season due to the coronavirus and the ensuing pandemic, and we're absolutely thrilled to be joined on the line by the outgoing president and CEO of the American Hockey League. Dave Andrews is with us to chat a little bit about what things have been like over the past few months and maybe try to shed a little bit of light on the situation moving forward. Mr. Andrews, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, happy to do it, guys.
Let's talk just generally, I suppose, about the last couple of months. I can remember pretty clearly back to the night that the season was canceled, really. The Belleville Senators had just played a game in Laval. They were set to go across the border to Utica, but came home instead. This whole thing really unfolded fairly quickly, didn't it?
Well, it did. We were actually in Boston on the 11th of March for the Ace Bailey Foundation dinner, and it's an annual event that we take all of our staff to. And we had an operational planning session during the day in a hotel in Boston, and Scott Howson, the incoming president, was there as well. Anyway, as it turned out, I spent the entire day on the phone calling all of our teams to see what their situation was in terms of public health, and because we were aware that one or two of our cities were going to have to play with no fans. I think probably San Jose and Providence were both at issue in terms of their ability to play. And so we spoke with all of our teams and kind of came to the conclusion that we would play through that weekend, the upcoming weekend, and then regroup on Monday and see where we were. So that was at 6 o'clock on the night of March the 11th. And by I don't know what time it was, we were at the Ace Bailey Foundation dinner with all of our group, and the NBA announcement came down. Well, as soon as the NBA announcement came down, we knew that things were done pretty much, and that so I was on the phone to Bill Daly right away, and the next morning early, the NHL met, and then we met in the afternoon, and our seasons were suspended. So that's how fast it happened, and so the contingency plan to work through until the following Monday was good for about 2 hours, and after that, I would say every contingency plan that we made seemed to be out the window within, as soon as you kind of finished dealing with all of your teams and talking to the NHL clubs and talking to the NHL, as soon as you kind of finished that and had a plan in place for the next step, the plan was already out of date. So it was a very hectic time in those first several days, and I think, I can't give enough credit to Bill Daly and to the National Hockey League for the support that they gave us through that time in terms of sharing information and sharing what they were hearing and what they were planning to do. And, because really our players are their players, as you guys know. So it was a busy time, and we were trying to stay in touch with all of our clubs and all of our stakeholders. And we had officials on the road that we had to get home, and teams on the road that had to get home. And it was pretty difficult. And then getting to the point of where we could get our players out of their cities and back to their homes was, all of that happened within, I guess, 4 or 5 days. But you can imagine that every team in the NHL was kind of chasing down Bill, trying to figure out what the next steps were, and our teams were doing the same with me. So it was pretty hectic, and then it's been, to be honest, it's been really busy ever since. Every day has been we elected to work remotely beginning on the 12th with our staff. So we came back from Boston, and immediately everyone went to their own, brought their computers and went to their own homes, and we haven't been back in the office since. So 9 weeks of working remotely with all of our staff and working obviously at a distance from all of our teams as well. And it's been, wrapping up 1920 was, there's a lot of stuff we had to try and, cancel. Our spring meeting was canceled. Our annual meeting was canceled. Our team business meetings in Tucson were canceled. The Players Association meeting was canceled. I mean, my entire month of June generally is the Calder Cup finals and all of these various meetings. And all of that went out the window. And you're trying to cancel trying to roll over your flights that were all booked for that period of time for all of our officials and ourselves. And it's crazy, like trying to mitigate it. And our teams had to do the same.
Dave, in your 26 years in this position, you've seen it all. You've handled just about everything that can come down the road. But something like this obviously is completely unprecedented. How has this challenged you in a way that maybe the more typical challenges of this job typically don't test you to this extent?
I would say that it's probably the most difficult leadership challenge that I've faced. I mean, I've had a lot of difficult business challenges and different issues that we've had to resolve and sort of strategic things that we've had to make happen and all of that, and which means working with a lot of stakeholders and bringing them together and helping to solve problems and mediate and arbitrate and move things forward. So there are challenging responsibilities that you have in this job from time to time that are not easy. But this is the most difficult leadership challenge I've seen, and I would think it's probably a difficult leadership challenge for every person because even with your families and individually, like trying to stay positive and focused and make sure people are well, and dealing with the really difficult part is the uncertainty, and that's what's giving us all heartburn because we don't know what is ahead of us exactly, and we are hopeful and we're trying to make sure that we're proactive and we're preparing for all of these various eventualities that are ahead of us for 2021. But there is a whole lot of uncertainty, and it's troubling for everyone. And so to provide good leadership in those circumstances is difficult.
In a situation like this, you mentioned all the various stakeholders that are involved in something like this, and you're modeling different scenarios for next season. But how difficult is it to do that modeling when you really, so much is out of your control and you really don't know? And, especially in hockey where everything is pretty much, you can count on a certain time of the year, a certain thing that you need to be ready for. But now all that's out of your hands.
The answer is that you can't let that paralyze you. The fact that there's so much uncertainty and that things could go sideways or maybe will go sideways in some cities and not in others, you can't say, well, we don't know anything, so we're just not going to do anything. We really have to be, if we're doing our job properly, we're giving some comfort to all of our teams and to all of our NHL partners that we are actively preparing for a lot of different scenarios, and that we're going to be able to deal with whatever comes our way when the time comes, that we can open up in some markets and not others. We can, some teams may be sustainable and not others in certain scenarios. So we have to try and prepare for all of that and understand, what the situation is with all of our teams for different eventualities. And again, at the end of the day, you're right. We don't know what's going to happen. And we can't control what's going to happen because it's going to be controlled by the public health authorities in 31 different cities. But to let that sort of paralyze you and have you not working and not preparing and not showing the leadership that people are looking for is kind of not the right thing to do. So we've been digging in now for quite a period of time. For 9 weeks, and we kind of pivoted 2 weeks ago from managing the 1920 situation that we had to really starting to focus on 2021.
A lot of fans have asked this question, and they tend to get right to the point of, will there be a next season, assuming things remain at least as we have them right now? And the second part, will all 31 teams play next season, or is that something that is still very much up in the air?
Well, we can't answer that question because we don't know what the future holds for us. We are building a schedule for an October to April season for all 31 teams right now. We are doing that optimistically. We have to be ready to play if we're able to play, so that work has to get done, and it's being done by our staff as we speak. We're also building models for delayed starts. If that's what happens and we can't play in October with a sufficient number of teams, then we're looking at November, and we're building for December. We're building for January with different types of playoff formats, with different lengths of schedule. All of that is underway right now and being shared with our teams so that they can see what some of the options might look like. But to say that you just can't predict whether we'll play or not. We're preparing to play, and I can tell you every one of our teams is preparing to play. So we think we'll play. We just don't know what it's going to look like.
We're chatting with the outgoing president, CEO of the American Hockey League, Dave Andrews, here on Around the A with David Foote and Patrick Williams. Dave, a lot's been made about the potential for the NHL and other major pro sports leagues to play without fans, and a lot of the early conversation around the American Hockey League is that that's probably not a real possibility. Where do you sit on that side of things? Is there a chance that we could see games played without fans in the AHL, or is it simply not viable?
Again, you have to kind of think a little bit outside of the normal paradigm of what the American Hockey League looks like when you ask a question like that. Because could we play games without fans? Yeah, we could. Could we play a whole season without fans with 31 teams? I would say it's very unlikely. You can look at different scenarios where our league could start and 3 or 4 teams know that they can't start, but they're going to start a month later. Would they play their 4 or 5 home games that month in front of an empty building in order to just be part of the league? I would say probably. So, it's not as though all 31 need to be doing the exact same thing at the same time. It's kind of when do you get a critical mass of teams that would allow you to have a meaningful season. So, and I think too, there's certainly a possibility that some teams on a regional basis, if 4 or 5 of them are able to open up before everybody else can, we'll help them have some sort of competitive framework that they can do that. So it's really it's an empty whiteboard in a way that we're going to have to be prepared to react to. But we're filling in we're kind of filling in a way that once we see what the landscape is and what our teams are wanting to do and prepared to do, we can deliver for them.
Is there much sense on a timeline of when you can start to put stuff on the whiteboard, or is it still very much a holding pattern, again, based on everything else that's going on around the world with this outside of hockey?
Well, we've got lots of stuff on the whiteboard now. We're really moving forward fairly quickly with building contingency plans for the league. So, are any of them going to be the right one when the time comes? I don't know. But at least we've got some built, and we've got time ahead of us. It's one of the things that I think I'm hopeful about is we still have a lot of time. For things to change, for things to get better. It's mid-May. In a normal situation, we would be dropping the puck, I think, October 9th to open our season. If that becomes November or December, it's a long way off. From now until December, there's a lot of time for us to be hopeful that we will be able to play with fans in the building in some configuration. So, there are so many ways you can look at this, and it's why it's difficult, because we don't know. It's uncertain what it's going to look like.
Is there one thing that you're kind of hoping for as far as a sign that you'll be able to move ahead and take the next step, whether it's, the easing of travel restrictions, which is a big thing. Obviously, I'm sure some sort of vaccine, which is probably not close, but I'd imagine that would help things moving forward. Is there something that a target maybe that you guys are looking at to say, all right, if this happens, we can move ahead? I
don't think so. I think it's really going to be, a really simple answer to that is our ability to play is going to be dictated by public health authorities in 31 different cities. And whether there's a vaccine or not, the public health authorities in Belleville or in Utica are going to make the determination of whether we can have our players in the building, whether we can have fans in the building, and when we can do that. So, we need to be, I'm repeating myself, I guess, but we need to be nimble enough that we're looking at, as we go through the summer, that we have various critical dates that we know if we get beyond that date and we don't have a sufficient number of teams that are going to be able to play, and I don't know what that number of teams is, which would be your next question, but, those trigger dates are when we're going to have to, kind of say, yep, we're good for October, or no, we're not, let's move on to plan B. There's so much uncertainty, but I do know that we're not going to be able to, in any configuration until we get the go-ahead from public health authorities that it's safe for our players, first of all, and second of all, that it's safe for some configuration of fans to be in the building at a level that makes our business sustainable. Those are all things we're going to have to wait and see. I think there's another piece of this too, that the player development side of it. I think it'll be interesting to see how NHL teams decide to get their players active if we aren't able to compete, and when they would want to do that. So there's a whole other conversation, around, if we're delayed, what does it look like in terms of decisions made for bringing players in?
Dave, you look at the fan base in this league, by and large, in most of these cities, it's a lot of middle class and families and the working class, and you look at some of the unemployment numbers in both Canada and the States, pushing in the 20 to 30 million range. How much of a concern is that long term? And given what the economic stress that some of these fans are going to be under, how much emphasis is there on being sensitive to the financial concerns that a good portion of your fan base is going through right now?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of consideration and concern for that in every one of our communities and with our team leaders who interact, on a daily basis with their fan bases and their sponsors. I'm sort of hopeful in that I can tell you that when we went through the last kind of big economic downturn, which was 2008 or somewhere in there, I think 08, 09, we had pretty bad economic downturn and high unemployment in a large part of our territory in those days, and we actually did better than most sports organizations did. We're at a pretty good price point, and the support for our teams didn't. We were growing our revenues through that 2 or 3 year period when people were really having a hard time. That kind of our type of fan, the middle class, working folks with their families were having hard times, but it didn't seem to really impact our league in a real negative way. Now, this is a whole new situation right now. I mean, 08-09 was bad, but this is going to be much worse, I think. So, is it a concern? Sure it is. But let's hope that, let's hope for the sake of everyone that loves the game and have been fans in our communities that we're able to play and provide people with an opportunity to get out and have some fun with their family at a reasonable price.
When you look at the issue of the independently owned clubs, something that seems to be cropping up a lot, in different discussions I've had. To what extent will you and the league as a whole be able to help some of those discussions, between possibly getting some financial support for those clubs that are independently owned and may not be able to make a go of it if there are not fans in the building, at least for part of next season?
Those are generally discussions that take place at the team level, and our independently operated teams have, for the most part, very good working relationships with their NHL affiliate. I think as the time gets closer to seeing what our season might look like, there will probably be conversations between those NHL clubs and AHL clubs about what the financial model needs to look like in order to be operational. So, but they're all going to happen at different times with different people, and I get involved. I won't be because I'm not going to be in the job at that point. But normally speaking, I would be getting involved, usually if necessary, at the request of both parties to help them find a solution. So, I think what I've seen so far is I think the NHL clubs are understanding of our circumstances, and our guys have to be understanding that the NHL situation isn't awesome now for NHL owners either. So, everybody's dealing with a difficult circumstance. I also, I think it seems as though I've been doing a lot of media over the last couple of days, and it seems as though there's a sense that, many of our independent teams are not sustainable. I don't think that's the case. Like, we have very strong ownership with our independent teams. I mean, if you look around at the 12 teams that are independently owned, some of those owners are capable of owning NHL teams. So it's not as though these teams are on the brink of disaster. Certainly, they're all sustainable through this past year with the hit that we took. We lost 20% of our revenues probably over because of this, and they're all fine. Would they be fine playing in front of no fans for a year? I don't think so. But I don't think we're at risk of losing franchises or anything because of what's happened in 1920. And if a team is unable to play for whatever reason next year as a result of COVID, I mean, they may take a team might take a year off, right? But it's all conjecture right now, and I know that our owners want to play, and I know they have the financial ability to play. I know that we're building schedules that should enable them to be able to play. So I think we're going to play next year. I mean, all of this talk about uncertainty. If you ask me, are we going to have an American Hockey League schedule next year that's workable and meaningful and can be played? I think the answer is yes. It might not be in October, but we're going to play.
A few more minutes here with Dave Andrews, the outgoing president and CEO of the American Hockey League. It's interesting to hear that thought, Dave, on the impact on current teams. It seems like everybody you feel is in a good position to kind of withstand this storm in one shape or another.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of very positive years in the American Hockey League, and we haven't had a lot of ownership change. Our guys are very committed. They're good community people, and they have the financial resources to do it. So, there's no question. There have been times during my career here that wasn't the case, but certainly for the last number of years, we have a very strong ownership group, and we have not had any real issues of sustainability of a team for a long time.
It's extremely encouraging for the fans, for sure. How about the two new clubs coming in? Obviously, Vegas getting their franchise supposedly to start this season, and then Palm Springs for next season. What type of impact will this have on those clubs in setting up their operations and things like arena construction? Or is it too early to tell on that front as well?
Well, Vegas is certainly ready to go. They have an arena ready to go. They have their staff in place. We have been working with them on orientation sessions over the past probably over the past month. Our staff have been working with their staff to sort of share with them everything they need to know to play in the American Hockey League, and from our hockey operations people to our marketing people to the licensing folks. So the Vegas team is up and running and ready to go and staffed up, and so once we get started, they'll be getting started for sure. Palm Springs, I don't know. They're not scheduled to play until 21-22. I think the only way that there's a negative impact on them would be if it's affecting construction of their facility, and to be honest, with all of the things that have been on my plate, I haven't even thought about contacting Palm Springs to see how things are going.
Speaking of that new franchise out in Henderson, really there's never been a situation to have a launch of a new franchise under these circumstances. What sort of impact does that have on that launch, in terms of marketing and fan support and everything that typically a club needs to do when they enter a new market?
Well, I think they're giving that a lot of thought in terms of how and when they roll things out. And that's a decision that'll be made out there. The president of the Golden Knights, Kerry Gubolts, is a former president of our team in Cleveland, and so he's really aware of the American Hockey League. And as you know, Patrick, they've done a wonderful job in Cleveland over the years, and so they're building an organization that's going to be very strong for their American Hockey League team, and I'm sure the decisions that they'll make relative to timing and how they're going to approach rolling the team out there is it'll be done right. But again, I understand the questions. It's just these are not things that are really crossing my mind right now. It's just kind of only so many hours in the day.
How much of a concern, especially for some clubs that have had to cut employee hours or furlough employees, how much of a concern is employee attrition at some point if these employees, maybe somebody in a marketing situation or an accountant or what have you, they decide that maybe the hockey business is a little too unpredictable right now, and they look for something in a different industry. That concern, how much do you sense from some of your clubs out there?
I think it's a very real concern. I think one of the really difficult things for our team leaders and for our owners is facing the reality that we're at some point furloughing staff and rolling back salaries and doing our best to take care of our people in a situation that's very difficult. And if as things become less as they become less optimistic, should they become less optimistic, you're faced with those hard decisions. And you do run the risk, obviously, of losing good people if you lay people off or furlough them, or at some point they may elect to go in a different direction professionally than to stay in our business or stay with our team or with our league. So, yeah, it's a very real concern for anyone having to make those kinds of decisions. It's not easy.
Airline travel, especially now, given a coast-to-coast league. The airline industry's obviously had a really difficult time for the past 2 months, and some of your clubs even at some point next season would possibly need to travel, both from a health standpoint and also just a cost standpoint if there are fewer options. How much of a concern is that, especially for some of those clubs out west?
Well, it's absolutely a concern. For all of our clubs that are required to travel by air, it's one more of those variables that has to be taken into consideration. I mean, if we can't get from A to B, then B is not going to be able to play. So, those are things that have to be considered as we move forward. we have a number of our cities that are clearly, flights are required to get there, in and out of there. And but again, at this point, I just got an offer from Southwest at $49 anywhere they go. So there are planes flying, and we'll just have to see what the situation is as we get closer.
In July, if it looks like an October start or at least an early fall start is possible, would there be a schedule release, or is that something that would be delayed for fans?
Well, I think we would probably. It's a very good question. We should have a schedule ready, Patrick, around the middle of July. We're a little bit delayed. The last few years we've had it ready around the 4th of July, and I think we're going to be later than that for sure with the potential release of the schedule. We're going to have to figure that out. Whether we could release or not. We do have an idea of when we would have to kind of fish or cut bait, if you will, for an October start, and it's fairly well along in the summer that we can wait before deciding. But whether to release the schedule early or not, we'll have to kind of decide that.
Mm-hmm. To what degree does this change Scott Helson's transition? And at some point, would you consider taking on maybe a little bit more of an advisory role than you would have planned on otherwise?
It won't affect the transition for Scott. Scott will take over as president on July 1st, and I will move into kind of an honorary position of chairman of the board of the league for a period of time. And I certainly have made a commitment to give Scott all the support he needs, and I have an obligation to do that as well. So, you don't put in as many years as I have here and not want to help Scott be successful. He'll have all the support he needs and all the support he asks for, but otherwise I'll get out of his way. That's what you're supposed to do when you retire.
With Dave Andrews, the outgoing president, CEO of the American Hockey League. A couple more questions, Dave, and we wanted to get a couple of fan-submitted questions in as well. Again, answers may be dependent on the situation, but we wanted to get them out there. One of them kind of relates on moving forward and maybe expanding to other parts of, in this case, the southeastern U.S., given all of the NHL clubs that are down there and the move by NHL clubs to be a lot closer geographically to their AHL affiliates. Do you see maybe some sort of shift to getting some more teams down in that part of the country?
Not really, not at the moment. I mean, we're really pretty well entrenched in the cities that we're in, and I know, for example, that Tampa is really happy and has a great relationship in Syracuse. So there's no real pressure from Tampa or Florida to own their own franchise or move a franchise down closer to them. There's been no talk in that direction over the last little while. So I think our current geography is likely to stay our geography for a little while yet, for sure.
And another one has to do a little bit more with this being your final season. Sean O'Brien asking that if you could write a letter to yourself on your first day as the AHL president back when you started, what advice would you give to yourself now?
What advice would I give myself? That's a really tough question. I don't know. If I could do it all over again, I think I would do it pretty much the same way. I guess it would have been nice to know that things were going to work out as well as they did. To be honest, like back then it was a pretty tough. We were in a pretty tough situation in 1994, as Patrick knows. Looking back in those days at what the league looked like and the competition we had with, we're in with the IHL, and we had some real challenges in terms of the viability of the league back in '94. So I guess if I could have given myself some advice, it would have been, don't worry about it. It's going to turn out fine.
Just, when you're looking at kind of the more immediate landscape, a couple affiliations are up in the air right now. Carolina Charlotte, obviously, has been much discussed. And Chicago Wolves and Florida Panthers also are open right now. Hershey, Washington still has to finalize. To what extent do you have a timeline for when we might have an announcement on some of those clubs?
I don't have a timeline. I know that there's ongoing conversations, and I don't think anything is cast in stone yet or on paper. So but I'm not very concerned that, particularly with, that Florida and Carolina will not arrive at a home that they're comfortable with and that our owners are comfortable with. So, again, it's not a real burning issue right now. I've been in contact with all of the teams involved for sure, but I don't know what the timeline is for a decision, and so I can't really give you any insight there. Hershey and Washington, I think, are moving along in a good direction, and will arrive at a new agreement. As you know, that's been a really productive affiliation relationship for a long time, and it works well for both Hershey and for Washington. So I think they're just ironing out some details relative to the business side of it, and it'll get done.
We'll finish on this, Dave. We talked a little bit about Vegas and their start. Obviously, fans in San Antonio are in a bit of a tough spot right now. That market had good attendance for a long time, and it's one of those situations that, there's not a whole lot that you can do when a team makes a purchase and moves the affiliate. If there's a message to those fans in San Antonio, what would you have to say to them?
Well, first of all, thank you. And we are really disappointed not to be still playing in San Antonio, believe me. That's been one of our great success stories. It's been a great partnership for the league with the Spurs. And personally for myself, Rick Pitch, who was the president of the Spurs, who's just retired, and Frank Maselli, who was in Philadelphia back when I started in the league and has been in San Antonio with both the basketball and hockey franchise. Like, we're losing really good friends that have been on our board and I've worked with for many years. But a business decision was made, and it wasn't because the franchise wasn't successful, and the fans supported that team in a really positive way. And it was a great building and a great fan base, and there was nothing that anyone could have done there to prevent the sale of the team to Vegas. I mean, Vegas were very aggressively wanting to buy an American Hockey League franchise. They really wanted one badly. And at some point, someone was going to say, you know what, yeah, we'll do that. That's a deal we're interested in. And I think as the Spurs made a decision that they wanted to focus, I think, with some of their other properties as well. They've been moving away from some additional properties and focusing more on basketball. And obviously that's their that's their prerogative. So we thank them, though. I mean, the Spurs have been great partners for us, and we've learned a lot in our league from them. They've been leaders.
Well, and we've learned a lot from you over the last 35 minutes or so, and we really do appreciate your time and making some time for us here, given everything that's going on right now. I know there's a lot of questions to be answered, and you and your team are doing your best to do that moving forward. So thank you so much for this, and good luck the rest of the way. Perhaps we'll be able to chat again in a couple months or so.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Episode 20 of Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network continues. Our utmost thanks to the outgoing president and CEO of the American Hockey League, Dave Andrews, for his time and his insight. Pat, one of those interviews that we probably could have extended for up to an hour, I would say, if his schedule wasn't so tight. Obviously understandable. He's got some bigger fish to fry, but nice to get a little bit of, I think, insight and clarification from him as far as the situation goes, and to me, a fairly positive tone from Dave Andrews as far as things look moving forward.
Absolutely, and I think for me that really stands out in the sense that knowing Dave for a long time, he's always been nothing if not realistic, and certainly as this business goes, just always one of the most forthright, honest people I've ever dealt with. And if there's a problem, he'll tell you generally that there is a problem, or if there's not, he'll say things are okay. So when he gives it a positive outlook, I take that more seriously than I would maybe from obviously some other executives out there, in sports and business who sometimes put a little bit more of a spin on it. Dave's an honest guy, so I think all things considered, given the situation, this is pretty good news if you're an AHL fan. The fact, a couple quotes really stood out from him, but when he said, "I think we're going to play next year," and just the tone of voice that he used to deliver that, I thought really sounded a really positive note. So, yeah, I think this is why it's always good to go right to the source, which is what we did. There's been so much conjecture, so much speculation out there, and frankly, a lot of times by people that aren't very familiar with the American Hockey League and apply the standards of different leagues in other elsewhere in hockey and even in different sports. Well, the American League is its own beast altogether, and sometimes the standard rules of thumb don't apply to this league. So that's why it's always great. Go right to Dave. He'll tell you pretty much how it is. And so, yeah, I think given the fact it's been a difficult week for AHL fans, I think that is the one positive that we can kind of take from this whole situation.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that stood out to me was his comment about the potential for all 31 teams not to play next year. And he pretty much said, if there's a team that says that financially they're not going to be able to make it through a season, we would rather have them take a year off than fold completely. And I mean, that's a crazy thought that one team would just say, hey, we can't do it. But I think that's extremely reassuring from the league standpoint that they're willing to accept that should it happen, and to try to work around it in order to help a team continue to be successful down the road.
Yeah, one thing about Dave, it is several really good strengths that he has for this position that serve him well and serve the league well. But I think pragmatism has always been one of his strongest suits, really, of anything. If that's what it comes down to, that a team just for one reason or another can't make it work for 2021, so be it. That doesn't mean that they're not still a strong franchise when things hopefully return to a little bit more sense of normalcy. And the other thing is just this league has worked so hard. Dave Andrews has been at this for 26 years. The league has doubled in size. They've worked too hard to let it fall apart now. So there's every incentive out there for them to work with teams on an individual basis and find a workable solution that helps everybody. So I think if you're a fan of a team out there, even if next season doesn't pan out the way you hope, I think at the very least you can take solace in the fact that come 2021, that you will have your team back, unless we're on a very different place. Heaven forbid that happens, but assuming things progress as most people seem to think they will. Hopefully, 18 months out from now, most of this will be in the past, and we'll be able to move on and get back to kind of normal life, quote unquote. Maybe it will be somewhat different from the way it was, but hopefully at least resembles most of what we had. So I think that first night back for a lot of fans will be really, really special, in a lot of ways. And, whether it's this October, next December, January, or even the fall of 2021, at some point, I think all fans will have their team back, and back on the ice.
And another interesting thing that he mentioned and said rather calmly was when he talked about how much time there is to make a decision. Everybody, us included, and others in the media, fans especially, are kind of clamoring for answers right now and, screaming for solutions and wanting to know what's happening right now. But the fact of the matter is we can't tell you what's happening right now. Dave Andrews can't tell you what's happening right now. And he makes a good point that they have a lot of time to make decisions and make plans moving forward. And to me, I think that's why they probably should have, put the axe on the season maybe a month ago when it really was starting to look dire. But now that they've done that, they can kind of, reset, look at the picture ahead and see what they're able to do.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, as bad as the announcement, as sad as it is, at least it does kind of close the book on this current season, and now everybody can pivot to looking ahead. And really, I've heard that concern expressed by so many different front offices that as difficult as it is to lose the rest of this season, the main thing is making sure that long-term health of the league is what's in order. And this allows teams now to really shift their focus to doing what they have to do to make things work, 3 months from now, 6 months, 9 months, whatever, and get things in order. And, just talking to coaches, one of the sentiments I heard is, as bad as this is an opportunity in a strange way. It's a chance to really have an opportunity to slow down, maybe reevaluate some things, re-examine the way you've done it, and maybe find a better way of doing things, whether that's a player, a front office member, a lead executive, whoever it might be. So perhaps now with a little bit more time on their hands, in some ways, teams will be able to go to the drawing board and map out different marketing programs or what have you. And if all goes well, the league comes out of this stronger than it went into it, and that would be a nice silver lining through all this.
And you know what? I think hockey aside, that's the nice silver lining, I think, for everyone. Take some time, reflect, try to improve yourself, learn something during these times, and, better yourself for when we come out of this and we hit the ground running moving forward again. While we've, closed the book a little bit on what's happening with the AHL and COVID-19, we're not done here on Around the A. We're going to be back next week with episode 21. Mike McKenna is going to be with us to talk a little bit about Vegas and what's happening with the move to Henderson for the San Antonio Rampage. We'll have a whole lot more. And then from there on out, Pat, I think we're going to be doing the show on kind of a when there's news, we'll have that news to talk about, and we'll be back sort of basis.
Yeah, we have some good possibilities that we're already working on, and it's interesting right now. With normally this time of the year, trying to get guests would be very difficult. Being with playoffs, I mean, anybody still in the playoffs, you can pretty much completely write off. Even if you're in the rink with them, the media accessibility gets a lot more difficult. But right now, we have nothing but time on our hands. So that's one of the, I suppose, the small silver linings that you can take out of this. That we'll be able to get some interesting guests. We're working on a few that I think a lot of fans will really find interesting. People that have all sorts of different perspectives and see this league and see this business from not the typical standpoint of us in the media or fans or what have you. So make the best of the situation. Like you said, come out of this stronger, use this time wisely, and that's what we're going to try to do with our show. So it's all really, any situation in life is what you make of it, and you can use it as a time to kind of pout, or you can use it to get better, and that's what we're trying to do here.
And with that, we'll remind you that if you've got some input on what you'd like us to talk about, who you'd like us to talk to, you can get at us pretty much on all of the social media platforms at Around the A Pod. Give us a follow on Twitter as well, and you can email us to aroundtheapod@gmail.com if you've got guest ideas, comments, thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to rate and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and check for updates as well at our parent network, the Sports Podcasting Network. Lots of good stuff coming up there as well, especially for those soccer fans who might be tuning in, because soccer will be one of those sports that does get going, and Kev Laramie and Dwayne Rollins at Soccer Today have got all the latest on the world of soccer, so make sure you check in with them. For now, we'll say goodbye from the Around the A studios. For Patrick Williams, I'm David Foote. Thanks again so much to Dave Andrews for his time, and thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed episode 20 of Around the A.
Thanks for listening to Around the A. Be sure to tune in again next week. Find Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Interact with us on social media. Give us your thoughts using the hashtag AroundTheA and follow us at AroundTheA Pod.